Hello, welcome. All right, so let's see what we have here. Glad to have you. So we're doing World War I and Woodrow Wilson. All right, and a couple things to note about this topic is, let's see here. I'm going to share with this. A couple themes that are commonly found when devising a narrative on Woodrow Wilson, and that is he's related to World War I because although the war was from 1914 to 1918, we didn't get involved until 1917. He ran for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." He still initially, asked Congress to get involved in war. So he's connected to World War I, and he's also connected to a theme that is present with just two presidents when I teach history. He and Thomas Jefferson both have a very curious contradiction between what they practiced and what they preached. And if you've had me for the earlier class, you've known we've gone over that theme, and we're going to go over a similar thesis regarding that discrepancy between what they practiced and what they preached. All right. So in World War I, you have the Triple Alliance against the Triple Entente, and the Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria, and Austria-Hungary in the Ottoman Empire, and the Triple Entente were England, France, and Russia. And oftentimes when you get into the narrative of the causation of World War I, you get into a lot of isms. You had imperialism or colonialism. When you look at the 1890s, right, and you see the way that Africa was carved up by European powers. As a case in point, you have a lot of dabbling in colonialism, taking over other countries informally and formally. Informally, I mainly mean like economically, but this was formal. This was actual, put an administration, put them under your national flag, etc. And so formal imperialism in the 1890s. And they're going to fight with one another at the diplomatic tables. So they're going to meet in the Congress of Vienna in Austria, and they're going to kind of fight over the scraps of other sovereign nations. Sorry, I got the hiccups. And so over other sovereign nations. And so like you see in the sense of sovereign nations, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Ethiopia actually was as an exception, but like Tunisia, right? There's a famous saying where Bismarck asked the French ambassador leader, "Are you still smarting over Alsace and Lorraine, of them taking Alsace and Lorraine, which is about right here on the map, from France?" And he says, "Here, if it makes you feel better, take Tunisia," as if Tunisia were his to give, right, in North Africa. And so you have that type of arrogance, that type of hubris by these powers. And then to assist that type of hubris, you had the so-called sciences, and we've gone over that with overseas imperialism, right, with social Darwinism and Nietzsche's writings and other writings at the time, especially social Darwinism and the white man's burden, etc. Contending that that certain races, certain nations are further culturally and even biologically evolved than other countries and nations and peoples, etc. And that hence they have this Darwinian right to take their land, to take their resources, to take their sovereignty from them. And so you have that as an issue that's going on. And then you have the Second Industrial Revolution, and countries like Germany and England are taking off in this second industrial revolution. And so then, you have like the Zulus down in Africa. They fought a very valiant fight against the English. They had a big upset victory at Isandlwana. But after that, it was a one-sided fight because they're fighting against Gatling machine guns with spears, etc. It's just there's no competition, and that enhanced their sense of superiority and justification for taking over their lands, etc. That they were more civilized and that it was for their own good, that they were going to modernize these people, etc. But they began fighting with one another over the scraps of the table. Like I said, look at the Congress of Vienna, if you wanted to look further into that, or the Congress of Berlin. And so at any rate, you have colonial competition. You could look up something called the Baghdad Railroad for Russia. Its fight for the Dardanelles, which is a warm water port right here, getting toward Constantinople into the Black Sea. Remember geopolitics. They were fighting for strategic areas, strategic bases and places in light of contingency, in light of the what ifs, as far as their biggest rivals and their biggest threats at that time. And they were looking at the global map as like a chessboard. And so at any rate, you had a lot of competition amongst the different monarchs and statesmen representing these countries that you see here on this map. And then you also had a counter reaction to that in the form of nationalism. And that was very prevalent in the Balkans, this area all right here. The Balkans in Southern Europe were, you had, romanticism as early as the 1820s. And it really came back again when Italy gained unification, as well as Germany in the 1870s, a sense of nationalism. And the nationalism in and of itself could be a good thing, can be, provocative of good measures, but it also can arguably become excessive. They have a word for that. They call it jingoism. And it's being rather xenophobic and petulant and diplomatically and militarily aggressive with your nationalism. And so you had that from above, from these countries, and you had it from below with the countries that wanted to be free. So for instance, the Balkans, right? Around 1906, they gained their independence from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turkish Empire, controlled parts of the Holy Land, Saudi Arabia. And so they had Arabic, Jewish people underneath them, Syrians, Jordanians in the future, etc., other groups underneath this Ottoman Sultanate. And they also had the Balkans, though they lost it by about 1906, I think. And it didn't take long for them to devolve into civil war, trying to carve out their own independent countries in the Balkan area. And when that happened, they met at Berlin and they decided, you know what, we're going to give that land because they're not capable of self-government for themselves and it's chaos and we need more stability there. We're going to give it to Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. We're going to give it to them. And so that's when Franz Joseph writes, and his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophia, they went down. And you have a bitter irony in that Franz Ferdinand was actually a bit liberal for his regime and his dual monarchy. He was for granting limited autonomy and limited self-government and representative government to the Balkan people. But they saw him as a symbol of imperialism, right? Of the Austrians coming down and taking them over. And so when he came down on a goodwill tour, he was killed, he and his wife. And so Franz Joseph gave a strong ultimatum to Serbia that entailed handing over Gavrilo Princip, the guy who assassinated them, the lead members of the Black Hand terrorist organization, and others over to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And they also wanted to give them, they wanted other concessions as well that the Serbian government took as humiliating. So the Serbians in this kind of contingency environment, they had already made overtures out to their fellow Slavic country, Russia, to Tsar Nicholas II. And Tsar Nicholas II had given promises to Serbia that he would protect them against international imperialism and against any kind of belligerent country coming to make war against them. So the Austro-Hungarians, they first moved their army down to the border, and the Russians mobilized their army first and moved their troops into Serbia. And so at that time, or prior to that time, France and Russia had made a contingency plan with one another. The French were supportive of the Baghdad Railroad. The Russians were supportive of French Morocco and claims over Morocco. And so they agreed to support one another's imperialistic claims, in addition to having a contingency military alliance in case one of them went to war with Germany. And you have to remember that, you know, from the Napoleonic Wars, then you had the wars of the unification of Germany of the 39 states, and they fought with France. They had the Franco-Prussian War. And so France and Germany had been hostile, and they had taken Alsace, Lorraine, and other areas right in here from France. And so it had become politically astute and popular to be very anti-German in your stance as a French statesman, and to be mindful of German aggression. And so they formed an alliance with Russia. England had contended that she was going to keep her, quote, splendid isolation for about almost 10 years. She kept it until the Moroccan crises startled England with the German threat of force. And then also a guy named Admiral von Tirpitz declared a naval arms race with England. And so you have that part of it also. So you have imperialism, you have nationalism, especially nationalism from below that wants to impede that imperialism. You have these contingency military alliances, and then you also have an arms race between these European countries. And, you know, that's the proverbial question to this day, right? To what extent does an arms race deter a future belligerent from messing with you? And to what extent does it actually escalate tension and cause a fight? And so you have the arms race as a component that's usually tied into the narrative for the causes of World War I as well. So England is going to leave her splendid isolation before this and join the Franco-Russian alliance, and known as the Triple Entente. And so now Austria-Hungary comes down to punish Serbia. Russia comes to defend Serbia. Germany promises Austria-Hungary protection as a fellow Germanic-speaking and neighbor. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was in close with the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, who was Franz Joseph. And so Germany's tied into it to help them. And then France, Russia, and England promised to help one another. And so England and France promised to help Russia to help Serbia. And before you know it, it devolves into a world war. Okay. And so those are just the basics. It's been a long time since I've read it in depth. So then you have here, George V of England, his prime minister here on the far right, Lloyd George. You have Tsar Nicholas II, his cousin, as you see the resemblance of Russia. And then you have Poincaré and Clemenceau, the prime ministers during the War of France. So these are the Triple Entente powers up here. And then you have the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance. You have Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. You have Franz Joseph of the Austrian dual monarchy with the Magyars or the Hungarians. And then you have Karl I, who takes over when he dies in the midst of the war. And then you have Mehmed V of the Ottoman Empire as the leaders of the Central Powers. And then, of course, we're covering Woodrow Wilson as the president of the United States during this time. Okay. And so the von Schlieffen plan was to attack through Luxembourg and Belgium and come and eventually try to take Paris before Russia could move in and they'd be forced to fight a two-front war, which of course they ended up doing in both world wars. So they come here and they were largely stopped in Belgium. Belgium would be contested for the entire 4 years of the war. So, Germany expected to get right through Belgium, and that didn't happen. And so all what I'm saying now is leading to the fact that it's gonna devolve into a stalemate, into a long, bloody war, the end to which could not be seen. So German and Russians, they fought, and they fought first in Prussia, and Prussia is where they connect, which is a logical part for them to fight right here. And the Germans are going to do very well in Prussia, and they're going to within the first 2 months of the war capture 90,000 soldiers of the Russian army from their 400,000 man army into Prussia. And so the Russians are going to decide to head south and to fight in Austria-Hungary instead. So the Germans are going to have to spread their troops from Prussia here to Austria-Hungary. Romania will later get into the war, so they'll have to fight against Romania, and they'll send troops into the Balkans, and then they're also fighting here. And very curious point on World War I is that the German army got within 30 miles of Paris, and they spread their army out into 7 armies and a 435-mile line of fighting down all the way to the Swiss border. And, the kind of the what ifs of history, had they just kept their men together, who knows what could have happened, and then possibly taken Paris. But that didn't happen. And so at any rate, they spread it into 7 different armies, and they're spread thinly, to say the least. And so then Germany fights in Russian Poland as well. And so their troops are everywhere. And within the first 4 months of the war, it devolves into trench warfare, right? As you see there in the picture, deadly weaponry and urban attacks, mustard gas used at Ypres in Belgium. And there were 3 major battles in Ypres, and just vicious fighting. And you see these guys with the gas masks on, etc. And then the war becomes globalized. The Allies attack German-occupied Africa. You see all the parts here on this map. Japan takes Tsingtao, China, and tries to get further inland into China. It has its own designs, right, as an ally to the Triple Entente. The Balkans hosted the Army of the Orient, and that was an army primarily of the British Empire colonials. And so East Indians, the French, Vietnamese, French Indochina troops. So a very, very polyglot group from all over the world, Australians, etc., fought in the Balkans, and then went into Turkey, into the Dardanelles, and tried to take Gallipoli. And that was a major failure. And that was one other point at which it became evident to all powers that this was going to be a long, drawn out, possibly inconclusive fight, World War I. And so Constantinople and the Suez Canal were geopolitically coveted, and so they were sought after by the British Empire. It took them 3 years to take those. It wouldn't be till 1917. Enver Pasha declared an Ottoman attack on the Russian Caucasus, and that was a failure, a shipwreck. And but again, it was like nowhere was it conclusive, and it drew the war out. And then at this time, you also had the Turkish persecution of the Armenians, right, where they attempted genocide against the Armenian people. So February 1916, the Anglo-French attack on the Somme River was interrupted by the German attack at Verdun on the Meuse River, heading from the south to Paris. Joffre gave a lot of latitude to Pétain, and Pétain wanted to go from an offensive strategy to a defensive one. And you see here, like at Verdun, 20 million shells were dropped of artillery. And so artillery, the machine gun nests, the tank, all these new inventions, the airplane, are going to make warfare deadlier, and it's going to project itself onto cities, into what they would call total war, which will really manifest itself in World War II, when they stop discerning between combatants and non-combatants and they attack entire cities. But also, right, it made the old school 1800s, cavalry attack deadly and obsolete, trying to attack machine gun nests and artillery pieces, etc., was just suicidal. And this was evident at the Somme. July 1st, 1916, Field Marshal Haig ordered an attack over an 1,000-yard breach between two trenches, and 20,000 were killed in one day. That's just insane. So this is just murder en masse at this time. All right, and then there were multiple blockades trying to starve one another into submission. And then, of course, the Germans tried to apply unrestricted submarine warfare, where they would just attack anything, any ship coming, merchant ship, neutral ship that came toward the British Isles. And this is going to be the reason for which we officially go into World War I, right? Was German attacks on our merchant ships. So anti-war sentiment grew at this time. There were mutinies in the French army and the Russian army especially. They're going to have by 1917 their Bolshevik revolution, and they're going to pull out of the war. Now the Germans could pull their troops out of Russia and send them to France and other areas where they were badly needed. The Americans were concerned because the Panther, the Sussex, the Arabic, and most infamously the Lusitania were shot down, and they had hundreds of American civilians who were killed in these attacks. So Wilson's administration issued a threat and an ultimatum to the German government. He said he wouldn't abide by this Prussian militarism. And remember, Prussia was only one of the 39 German states, but Prussia was synonymous with militarism. So it wasn't a mistake in language. It was symbolic of saying that Germany was guilty of barbarism, of militarism, etc., in these violations, because they'd had treaties, right? They had a London conference in 1909, and they were deciding on rules of conduct in fighting the war and in fighting. And this had evolved from the Catholic Church and its notions of just war doctrine. We're going to get into more when we do World War II. But in that philosophy, if you will, and in that Catholic tradition, it was noted that non-combatants are to be left alone, right? And that also includes merchants who are trading with either one or both belligerent sides during war, as long as they didn't go against the list of ammunition and war products, right? Contraband. And we were just trying evidently to sell wheat and corn and clothing, etc. And it was being confiscated by the British when we tried to trade with the Germans. And then the Germans were shooting us down in the British Isles and killing Americans, civilians. And so at this time, the Secretary of State was William Jennings Bryan, and he was furious with President Wilson because he felt like he needed to give an ultimatum to both sides, not just one. But what Woodrow Wilson said, which you could probably anticipate, is he said German violations were more grave because they took away human lives and not just mere produce. And so that was his official reason for being tougher against German violations of international law and rights than English violations. England and France owed us $2 billion. JP Morgan and others had lent a lot of money. That same number, we had sold by that time $2 billion worth of products to the Triple Entente powers. And so some contend that we were financially invested into the Triple Entente, and we had financial reasons to want to see them prevail. Okay. And we'll get into his Whig principles when I get onto the assignment. And then there was the famous Arthur Zimmerman telegram, where he gave a German diplomat, gave the German ambassador to Mexico a telegram inviting the Mexican government in the event of the US going to war with Germany, trying to get the Mexican government to side with Germany and fight against us, promising the Mexican government its lands back from clear back at the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the US had taken from them in the far west. So you had the Zimmerman telegram, and that got a lot of national attention in the press and a lot of concern and anger against Germany. Then arguably the tide begins to turn. Romania, China, and Greece entered for the Triple Alliance. And again, it spread the Germans thinly. They only had a certain number of men that could fight. The Middle East was won by Britain all the way up to Aleppo, and the Ottoman Empire would soon sue for its own peace. At Messines, there was a convoy system, and that began to bode well against the submarine attacks. The Reichstag, which is the Parliament of Germany, had issued a peace resolution in the summer of 1917 to show that they were interested in bringing an end to this war. And by 1917, you also had Allied air superiority. And what do you know, that same year, the United States joins the war with the Triple Entente, making it even more difficult for Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Empire. The city of Cologne began to be bombed at this time, and the German offensive was stopped at the Marne. And at this time, American soldiers had gone in there. They were oftentimes called Sammies, after Uncle Sam, or doughboys. And the doughboy could have come from the money or the dough that they brought with them, or their knapsacks that they kept on top of their backpacks behind their necks that looked like like bread, like a loaf of bread, dough. I've heard both interpretations, but they called us Sammies or doughboys, the American soldiers. And they fought at Cantigny, they fought at Chateau Thierry, they fought at Mount Falcone, and they did very well at Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood reads a little bit like a future Battle of the Bulge in World War II, where the Germans try in a desperate offensive toward the end of the war to break through the lines with one of their 7 armies. And they made an initial break, and the Allied powers plugged the hole back up, just like the Battle of the Bulge of World War II. So then you had an Allied 100-day offensive. Amiens was really big victory for the Triple Entente and for the Americans. According to Erich Ludendorff, he and Paul Hindenburg were the 2 military dictators of Germany during wartime. He said that he pronounced it to be a black day for Germany and ominous for the future. And the famous Hindenburg line had been broken at Amiens. And so hence, right, the writing seemed to arguably be against the wall, contrary to what Adolf Hitler will say in the future, that Germany did not lose the war and that they were betrayed by their diplomats, right? At Kiel, there was a major German mutiny that began to spread along the lines of the German troops. Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire separately sued for peace in 1917. And so finally, right, in the midst of the Meuse-Argonne offensive by the Americans and the French and the English, they're going to agree to the terms of a ceasefire on November 11th at 11 o'clock. And then a little bit of morbid history. Supposedly, American Henry Gunther was killed at 10:59. So at any rate, that was the end of the war. So let me go now, if you don't mind, to the handout. All right. If I can move it up there. So you have an introduction to World War I, and then you have Wilson's Whig inclinations rendered him pro-Triple Entente, not neutral. And that says it all in the title, right? So it gets into his academic career as a Princeton professor and later the dean of the school. He was for Whig history, right? He was for the Whig Party of England, for the democratization of societies gradually, constitutionally, without violence, without tumult, without revolution, for increasing representation for the common man, for protected constitutional rights for the individual, for checks and balances in the system of government, for a clear separation of and superiority of civilian government over military government and the military institutions. And so, according to number one, right, is this author that I read contended that Wilson was never truly neutral because he was a pure Whig at heart, and he despised everything that the Triple Alliance stood for. They were archaic to a large extent. You look at the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. You had an emperor, you had a landed nobility, you had a rubber stamping so-called parliament that did not directly represent the people that were underneath them. You had separate ethnic groups and groups of people that did not want the Austro-Hungarians to control them and to be over them. You had a Kaiser in Germany who had power to veto anything and remove the chancellor or the prime minister of the German Reichstag. You had a Junker, spelled like Junker class, that controlled the upper house of the Reichstag and made it truly not representative and not very much of a spokesman for the German people. You had a strong Prussian-dominated military that was given a lot of leeway. Like I mentioned, you gave dictatorial powers to Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg during the war. And then you have the Ottoman Empire that's going by Sharia law, still has a sultan. It looks like it's a bygone of the medieval ages, right? Because remember, the Ottoman Empire was at its heyday, like in arguably the 1400s. And so the Triple Alliance seemed to be archaic, undemocratic, and just unimpressive, and even dangerous as far as the rights of people in the eyes of this Whig, Woodrow Wilson. And then the argument is that he saw England and France as lesser evils. Notice I didn't mention Russia because he thought Russia was archaic by his standards. But England and France, they'd already had their movement in England for direct representation of all the boroughs or districts. They already had the practice of a multi-party system in Parliament, whereby the majority of seats that were won in a genuine election, that winning party got to choose the prime minister. And so they seemed more modern. They seemed more progressive. They seemed more up to Whig standards. So hence you have quotes from Wilson to some of his cabinet members, to his girlfriend, because his wife will die during the war, and he gets a girlfriend, and he acts very emotionally unstable after the death of his wife. And he confides to his girlfriend and to others that if the Triple Alliance wins, it'll be harmful for all of humanity. And it's in the best, and this is John Milton Cooper's book that I'm going by on Woodrow Wilson, by the way. And so, so hence that he truly wasn't neutral as he tried to claim himself to be, but that he might have been looking for an excuse to get into the war to ensure that the Triple Entente won for the betterment of humanity in his eyes. Okay, so are there any questions on number one? And then number two, again, the title says it all. Wilson felt compelled by circumstances beyond his power to defy his own beliefs and rhetoric. And so notice we're taking it easy on him on number 2, aren't we? We're not just contending that he's a hypocrite. We're not contending that he changed with power and became drunk with power, but we're contending, right, that it's one thing to be ideologically consistent when you are an academic. You could make sure that your books and your classroom lectures are consistent and uphold Whig principles, etc. But it's a whole other scenario when you become president and you have all these issues and problems that you face, and then you have to contend with them. So according to his own writings and in his own correspondence, Wilson was concerned about garnering public passion and support for the war. He was worried because of America's polyglot makeup. There were so many Irish Americans who hated the English and wanted to fight against the English and not with them. You had a lot of German Americans, especially in the Midwest. So he wanted to deal with that. You have a lot of radicalism that becomes arguably more powerful and more popular if Howard Zinn's book can be trusted. In the Midwest, like St. Louis and Milwaukee and Minnesota and Ohio, meaning like the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Wobblies, or the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, they began to win public offices. They were running for office, in some cases actually winning. They were gaining number of adherents. It won't be long and you'll have the Comintern that's established here in the United States, where they're literally trying to support the Soviet Union and try to implement a Bolshevik revolution here in the United States. So he is scared to death by all of this, right? You have sabotage in the factories, trying to blow up factories and blow up railroad tracks that are bringing military products from one place to another or trying to produce them, right? You have a few isolated terrorist attacks on, for instance, a subway station in New York, where a German left a suitcase and it exploded and it killed a handful of people. You have Ernst Kuhnwald, his case. You have a case where a gentleman said that as a composer, as a German composer, he wanted to assassinate President Wilson. So these are small in number, they're isolated, but you find evidence of fixation by Woodrow Wilson in which he is scared to death. He is concerned about all of this, right? And worried about garnering enough support. Also, when he sent his soldiers over, we did not bring nearly the number of men that were asked by Ferdinand Foch and Pétain and the leaders of the French army. They did not have enough supplies with artillery, especially tanks and airplanes, etc. We had to borrow from the French when we first came overseas and fought and used their equipment instead of our own. So he obviously became fixated on the problem of developing enough goods and services quickly enough to ensure triple entente victory in the war. And so what are some of the things that he did under these circumstances? All right. And pardon me here, I'm going to go back to my list. See here. I'll go back to that in a minute. A draft. He asked for volunteers. He received 80,000. That was nowhere near the more than million men that he needed. So he supposedly was reluctant. He tried to have it in decentralized fashion to make it less controversial and have the states do it and the local governments do it. But he issued a draft. They had a place in Kansas and a place in West Virginia where they kept inmates of people who were conscientious objectors. There were 330,000 people who defied the draft. And so he had to contend with that. And with those contending to be conscientious objectors, right? That it was against their religion and their conscience to fight. And his administration dealt pretty heavily handed with them and forcing them to fight and forcing them to enlist, go to Tampa Bay and these other areas and in Texas to train and to be sent overseas to fight. He issued the Committee on Public Information under George Creel. And it basically was a propaganda machine. 75,000 speakers gave 5-minute speeches, sometimes 2-minute speeches in over 5,000 cities across the country. And they issued over 1 million pieces of propaganda in literature, mainly in posters and in other forms. And when you look at the posters and other things, it was very, very crude. It had the German as basically King Kong, as this guerrilla type figure who was trying to ravish Lady Liberty, had her in his hands and is trying to run away with him. And he had a baseball bat or a club, and it said Culture Kampf on it. And that was an allusion to the culture battle against unpatriotic writing and sentiment amongst the German intelligentsia made by Otto von Bismarck clearly in the past, but they're drawing that back up. So it resorted to it was tantamount to just crude propaganda. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, right, stated that, let me read the Espionage Act, if you would, out of Howard Zinn's book. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the U.S., or shall willfully obstruct the recruitment process or enlistment service of the U.S. That's out of his book on page 365. So they're going to have 2,000 cases of people tried, indicted for it. And they're going to have 900 cases of convictions and arrests involving prison sentences, some up to 20 years in prison. And this included, right, encouraging people not to join the draft, to defy the draft. Something that simple could get you arrested for the Espionage Act. And that's exactly what happened to Carl Schenck. Carl Schenck was in Philadelphia. He had literature and had a rally against joining the U.S. forces, and he was arrested. He pled his First Amendment right, and in a very famous case, the judge decided that he was in the wrong, that he had violated his First Amendment rights. He had gone over the line in creating an environment of clear and present danger. And that's a clause that we have to this very day. And the Espionage Act has still not been nullified to this day. And so it's just interesting to note. And so the Masses was a communist or a socialist newspaper. It was shut down and refused to use the post office. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and Big Bill Haywood of the Communist Party and of the Wobblies were deported, were first arrested and then deported. And Eugene Debs was arrested for 20 years, although he'll be pardoned by President Harding. And Eugene Debs is a very interesting guy. His brother died in a railroad accident. His dad had banks take the land from him. And so his life experiences kind of just led him to be a socialist, where he wanted government control of the major industries and, taken out of the hands of big businesses and bankers, etc. And then A. Mitchell Palmer had his house bombed. and he was given a green light to go after the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. So 48 meeting halls were attacked. 165 leaders were immediately arrested without much of their Fourth Amendment rights to privacy. And 249 aliens were deported. And then after that, it'll go up to 4,000 more, known as the Palmer raids. Then in addition to drafting, to having a propaganda, and you got to remember the propaganda thing was ironic because he was for intellectual autonomy and academic discourse, for people to freely disagree with one another, have discourse, have dialogue, have debate, right? And have that freedom of conscience. But then he didn't practice it during World War I. There were American protective leagues that were like these grassroots vigilante groups, and he supported them in trying to arrest people who were guilty of the Espionage Act. And so it's something to think about. Kind of ironic, right? And then in addition to that, to those things, he was against big business. He was against the trusts, but he helped them to win a lot of money with contracts. And his argument, right? He said, what am I going to do? Go to a bunch of mom and pop shops and ask them for all the artillery and the tanks that I need? No, I need to go to the JP Morgans and US Steel. I need to go to the big guys who can mass produce what we need as quickly as possible. So rather than breaking up the trusts and decentralizing the economy for mom and pop and small businesses' sake and the smaller entrepreneurs, he made the big businesses wealthy through these lucrative contracts, these war contracts. So you see all the ironies of this guy, this liberal president who did a lot of conservative things during the war. But again, with number two, it's contending, right, that he felt as if he didn't have a choice, that this idealistic man had to become a pragmatist, had to become practical minded in his decision making. And so at any rate, you have also his idealism with his 14 points, etc., right? You go up here with his 14 points. No secret alliances or treaties, right? In this new world order. A reduction of armaments, kind of like the SALT Accords later on, strategic arms limitation treaties. Freedom of the seas for all peoples and all countries. Self-determination for all peoples to decide for themselves what to do with their own government, etc., without outside interference. And multilateral liberal containment, a multinational body that would adjudicate or arbitrate disputes between countries, would intercede when human rights violations were going on, like in the Ottoman Empire against the Armenians, and would intercede if one country tried to invade another, to try to uphold the tenets of classical liberalism, of individual autonomy, each country's independence, human rights, constitutionalism, checks and balances, representative government, to secure that at the international level. All right. But what happens at Versailles when peace was signed at the end of World War I? Article 10 said the winners get to keep their empires. So there's some hypocrisy, right? Self-determination, but only self-determination for those who were under the losers. So the Ottoman Empire had to give self-determination to new city-states like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. Austro-Hungarian Empire had to give way for a new Yugoslavia, etc. But England could keep South Africa, East India. France could keep French Morocco, and the United States could keep the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So hypocrisy, right? According to Article 10. And then it's Article 231 or 251. I apologize. I keep forgetting what number it was, but it's the punitive measure against Germany. They took about 10% of German lands from them, saying in the name of self-determination to these other peoples, and namely like Czechoslovakia and Poland. They kept their army to 100,000 man army. They scrapped their navy to very negligible numbers. They put an international army of people in the Rhineland, R-H-I-N-E land, there on German soil to prevent another German invasion of France. And so all this stuff, right, highly punitive toward Germany. And that was not according to his rhetoric, to be punitive like that and to take lands from and deliberately weaken countries. And then ironically, they did form a League of Nations to adjudicate international disputes, to keep any bully from colonizing other countries, et cetera, right? But the US ironically did not even join it. He didn't bring any Republicans who at this time, by his second term from 1916 to 1920, were beginning to take over the Senate. And constitutionally, any treaty has to be approved by the Senate. And so they refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and we had our own separate peace with Germany that was made. And so we didn't join the League of Nations. The League of Nations became kind of a toothless tiger, if you will. And of course, Adolf Hitler is going to take advantage of that in the near future. Other things, things about Wilson. As a progressive, he was for bank reform. He wanted a Federal Reserve, where the Federal Reserve, right, could look at the lending practices of its member banks and withdraw funds and subsidies to them if they didn't have fair lending practices, for instance. And also, it was taking power out of the hands of the private bankers like J.P. Morgan and Jay Cook and so forth. And so that was seen to be a progressive measure, this Federal Reserve banking system. He was for graduated income tax, for safety net legislation to help out the less fortunate, but heavily tax the well-to-do. He was for the direct election of senators. He instituted, his Congress did, and he of course approved and was part of making the Clayton Antitrust Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act gave specified definitions for the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made it much more enforceable. So price conspiracies, et cetera, were put on a list. So if you did that, you could be more readily caught and convicted by the Department of Justice. And then the Federal Trade Commission, you had to give regular papers on your taxes and other things to the federal government so they could see if you were engaged in any kind of white collar crime, to hold big businesses more accountable. So those were some of his credentials as a progressive president. Victoriano Huerta, remember Porfirio Diaz was chased out of Mexico in 1910. He ruled with an iron fist, so to speak, from the year 1876 until that time. And then it devolved into a civil war. And so he supported a guy named Francisco Madero, who had a lot of liberal credentials, wanted representative government and all that, right? Well, his military leader, Victoriano Huerta, turned on Madero, had him arrested, and under bogus charges had him publicly executed. And Wilson warned Victoriano Huerta not to do that, saying Mexico needs to have, let the democratic process do its thing, right? And let Madero run for office freely and fairly. Instead, Madero was killed. Then you add to that the Tampico incident, T-A-M-P-I-C-O, where Americans ran out of coal and had problems with their naval ship. They stopped in Tampico. They were arrested, beaten. Some were even tortured by Huerta's armed forces. And so he invaded Tampico and Veracruz as punishment. And then also he at one time gave support to Pancho Villa, and he ended up giving the support ultimately to Venustiano Carranza instead. And Villa was defeated by Carranza's men in a key battle. Villa felt betrayed by the US, so he attacked Columbus, New Mexico, attacked a fort, but American citizens tried to defend the city and it ended up killing 21 American civilians. So he sent General John J. Pershing into into Mexico to find Pancho Villa, which of course they never did. Pancho Villa will be killed by the henchman of a future president of Mexico instead. And so that's ironic, right? Is this man for self-determination had Mexico invaded twice. And then also he failed with the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois called it, the race relations about African Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young was forced into early retirement when he was becoming the highest ranking African American in the armed forces on bogus counts of asthma. And so they just didn't want to see a Black man get up to that high of office. And remember, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, despite claiming he was progressive. And the Democrats were strong in the South. He didn't want to lose Southern Democratic support, and he himself was a Southerner. And so at any rate, that's all important to remember. And going back to the fighting, to me personally, I think numbers matter. I think like at Belleau Wood and at the, like I said, it was called the Meuse Argonne Offensive. American numbers mattered. According to Ludendorff, they did, of Germany. He contended they knew that in a war of attrition, of trying to outlast one another, that Germany could not win, primarily because the American soldiers that are coming in. On the Meuse Argonne offensive, there were 1.5 million doughboys present to fight. Because after all, right, it's like a 12-round boxing match, and we didn't get involved until round 9 or 10. The war was 1914 to 1918, and we didn't get involved until the spring of 1917. All right, and so are there any questions? Any questions regarding numbers 1 or 2 of Wilsonian idealism on trial? Any comments from you guys? Do you buy number 2 at all? That this guy totally defied and contradicted his own rhetoric because he felt like he had to in the midst of these circumstances of war?
I have one question.
Yes.
So could you explain a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson's academics?
Yeah, so Woodrow Wilson, right? He thought that the English Constitution was the exemplary example, right, for lack of a better way of articulating it, was exemplary for the world to follow. That it was organic, that it happened peacefully, but that it was progressively becoming more and more classically liberal, allowing more and more representation for the people, having better system of checks and balances, and being just truly representative of the people and being protective of individual rights. So to him, England was the country to follow, as well as, of course, the United States. And he felt like that society was meant and ought to evolve in that direction. And that the primary way by which the forces of that are archaic, like very militaristic, very undemocratic, very oligarchic, that those types of governments, the only way that they could possibly prevail was by naked aggression. So it was beholden to the liberal countries of the world to fight in the name of freedom against any kind of naked aggression by archaic countries, by undemocratic countries. Does that help at all, Jaden?
Derek, I have a question.
Sure.
This is going back a little bit, this might be a little bit, but do you mind explaining the difference between imperialism and colonism and nationalism?
Sure. Well, with colonialism, right, is remember that the big powers were taking over other countries, less developed countries, and they began to fight with one another over it. Look at the Congress of Berlin. You could look up the Moroccan crises, and England and Germany, for instance, almost went to war over Morocco. And so they're fighting one another for this, right? For these countries. And the Baghdad Railroad and other examples like that, a warm water port at the Dardanelles for Russia. Germany did not want those plans to materialize out of geopolitical competition. They didn't want them to have an advantage over them. And so then with the assassination, that was a byproduct of nationalism, of these countries that are colonized saying we want to have our own country amongst our own ethnic group with its own culture, its own traditions, etc. And so when Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, it set in motion these, what the alliances had begun, basically war. Does that help at all, Kevin?
That did help a lot. Appreciate it.
Uh-huh. Good luck with whatever you're doing. It looks like you're working. All right. Anyone else?
I said that. I don't know if you heard me. I said it did help. I appreciate it.
No problem.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So would you say that Woodrow Wilson accepted Nietzsche's writings about being fearful of Germany?
No, I would say actually that was more of his Whig principles that feared Germany, right? Rather than Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was no liberal. Nietzsche didn't care about individual rights. He didn't care about representative government. He thought democratic government was soft. He wanted, remember, like an Übermensch, a Superman, to take over as like a dictator of Germany. And so, no, matter of fact, in that sense, Woodrow Wilson would have been definitely against the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and would have been frightened by them.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, anybody else? Do you guys feel okay about doing 1 and or 2?
I feel pretty okay.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So did Woodrow Wilson evacuate the Philippines?
He made a plan for their gradual evacuation. And so, I mean, you got to hand that to him at least. But no, he did not. He would not let go of the Philippines at that time. We won't let go of them until 1946.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so anyone else? Anything else?
Since we're on the topic, you mind if I ask one more thing, Dirk?
Sure.
What about Cuba? Is Cuba do they have sovereignty at this time, or are
Yes.
did we take the land from them?
No, really what we did, Kevin, evidently, is to the Platt Amendment from 1898 to 1902 for 4 years, we controlled Cuba. And in 1902, we'd already had the Teller Amendment promising that we would eventually evacuate. In 1902, with the Platt Amendment, we got out of Cuba, but we declared the right to intervene in the name of stability or American self-interest. And then we leased by force, we forced upon them the leasing of Guantanamo